Welcome, dear listener, to Mystic Bedtime Stories, where ancient whispers meet modern dreams. I'm your guide on this journey through time, where we explore the forgotten corners of history with gentle voices and peaceful hearts. Tonight we venture far beyond the familiar pyramids of Giza, beyond the well-trodden paths of pharaohs, whose names echo through tourist halls and museum corridors. Close your eyes now, and let your mind drift like a feather on the evening breeze. Feel yourself floating southward along the life-giving waters of the Nile, past the bustling markets of Cairo, past the towering monuments of Luxor, deeper into the heart of Africa, where the river narrows and the desert stretches endlessly toward. Horizons painted in gold and amber dot here. In this quieter realm lies a story that has waited centuries to be told properly. A story of kings and queens whose skin gleamed like polished ebony under the African sun, who wore the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt with dignity and grace, who built pyramids that still stand sentinel over the sands of Sudan, pointing toward stars that guided their spirits home. Tonight, we journey to the Kingdom of Kush, where the forgotten pharaohs once ruled an empire that stretched from the cataracts of the Nile to the Mediterranean shores. These were the Black Pharaohs, the 25th dynasty, whose story has been whispered in the wind for too long, waiting for patient ears to listen. You see, dear friends, history is not always written by the victors. Sometimes it's written by those who came after, who chose which stories to preserve and which to let fade like morning mist. But the stones remember, the pyramids remember, the desert sands hold their secrets like a mother holds her children. And tonight we shall coax these memories into the light dot. So settle deeper into your pillow, pull your blanket close, and let the worries of the day dissolve like sugar in warm tea. We have time tonight, all the time in the world, to walk with pharaohs who ruled with wisdom, to stand beside queens who commanded armies, to witness the rise and gentle fall of a civilization that dared to dream beyond the boundaries drawn by others. The Nile flows eternal, as it has for millennia, carrying stories from the mountains of the moon to the delta where it meets the sea. And as it flows, it tells us of a time when the south wind brought more than just sand, when it carried the destiny of kings from the land of gold and ivory, from the realm of the bow and arrow, from the Kingdom of Kush. Our story begins not with conquest, but with longing, not with war, but with the deep, abiding love of a people for their gods, their traditions, and their sacred duty to preserve what was most precious about the civilization they had learned to call their own. For you see, the pharaohs of Kush were not conquerors in the way we might imagine. They were guardians, keepers of the flame when the lamp of Egypt grew dim. Picture, if you will, the sun setting over the Nile at Napata, painting the sky in shades of coral and gold. The sacred mountain of Jebel Barkal rises from the desert like a natural pyramid, its peak catching the last rays of light. This was the spiritual heart of Kush, where the god Amun was believed to reside, where the divine breath of pharaonic power was said to originate. Here, in this holy place, kings received their divine mandate not through birthright alone, but through the ancient rituals that connected them to the gods, to the land, and to the people they would serve. The pharaohs of Kush understood something that their northern neighbors had perhaps forgotten in their later years, that true power comes not from the ability to dominate, but from the wisdom to unite. And so, as the stars begin their eternal dance across the African sky, we prepare to meet these remarkable rulers. We'll walk with Pi, the first of the great Kushite pharaohs, whose victory stela tells of a conquest achieved through righteousness rather than mere force. We'll stand in the shadow of Taharka's pyramid, the largest built by any Kushite king, and feel the weight of his achievements settling around us like a comfortable shawl. We'll learn of the Kandakes, the powerful queen mothers who ruled in their own right, whose authority was recognized from the borders of Roman Egypt to the trade routes of the African interior. These were women who negotiated with emperors, who led armies into battle, who built temples that celebrated both the feminine divine and the strength of mortal queens. But more than just the grand gestures of history, we'll discover the quiet moments that made these rulers human. The prayers whispered in temple sanctuaries, the careful attention to ritual purity, the love letters carved in stone, the gentle governance that allowed diverse peoples to thrive under one crown. This is not a story of violence or conflict, though such moments existed in this tale as they do in all human stories. This is a story of patience and perseverance, of cultural flowering and artistic achievement, of a people who looked at the glory of ancient Egypt and said, "We can carry this forward. We can be worthy inheritors of this sacred trust." So breathe deeply now, and let the night air fill your lungs with the scent of myrrh and frankincense, with the clean smell of river water and the warm, comforting presence of ancient stone. Let your mind become quiet and receptive, ready to receive the whispers of Kush, the forgotten pharaohs who once ruled the known world with wisdom, justice, and an unshakable faith in the divine order that connected all things. Our journey begins now as night falls over the upper Nile, and we step across the threshold of time to witness the birth of a kingdom that would reshape the ancient world. Welcome to the land of Kush, where black pharaohs wore golden crowns, and where the desert sands still sing their ancient songs of glory. Let us travel now to a time before memory, when the world was younger and the boundaries between nations were drawn not by treaties, but by the natural rhythms of the earth itself. Between the first and sixth cataracts of the Nile, where the great river tumbles over granite boulders and creates pools of impossible blue, there stretched a land that the ancient Egyptians called Taseti, the land of the bow. The Greeks would later call it Nubia, from the word nub, meaning gold. For this was a realm where the precious metal flowed as freely as water from the earth's hidden veins. But the people who lived there, who built their lives along the fertile banks of the upper Nile, knew their homeland by another name entirely. They called it Kush, and in that single word lay the weight of identity, the pride of belonging, and the promise of greatness yet to come. Imagine, if you will, waking at dawn in this ancient land 3,000 years ago. The air is cool and sweet with the scent of river grass and blooming acacia trees. The Nile moves past your doorstep with the gentle persistence of time itself, carrying silt from the mountains of Ethiopia, carrying life to the desert, carrying the dreams of generations yet unborn. Above you, the sky stretches endlessly, painted in shades of pearl and rose, while behind you, the Nubian desert rolls away in waves of golden sand punctuated by dark outcroppings of granite and diorite. This was not the harsh, forbidding wasteland that some might imagine. The Nubia of ancient times was a garden, a corridor of fertility threading through the desert like a green ribbon. Date palms swayed in the morning breeze, their fronds whispering secrets to the wind. Dune palms stretched their fan-shaped leaves toward the sun, while beneath their shade women ground sorghum and millet, preparing the day's bread. The air hummed with the sound of daily life, children laughing as they played by the water's edge, fishermen calling to one another across the current, potters singing softly as they shaped clay vessels with practiced hands. But it was what lay beneath the surface that truly made this land extraordinary. Deep in the earth, following veins of quartz and granite, lay deposits of gold so rich that nuggets could be picked up from dry riverbeds after the annual flood. The pharaohs of Egypt had long coveted this treasure, and for good reason. Nubian gold was the finest in the ancient world, pure and malleable, perfect for crafting the regalia of kings and the sacred objects of temples. Yet gold was only one of Nubia's gifts to the world. From the highlands to the south came ivory, carried by trading caravans that followed paths worn smooth by countless generations of merchants. Elephants roamed the acacia forests in great herds, their tusks prized not only for their beauty but for their spiritual significance. To the people of Kush, the elephant was a symbol of wisdom and memory, of the connection between the earthly realm and the divine. The incense trees of the eastern hills provided frankincense and myrrh, those precious resins that would fill temple sanctuaries with their sacred smoke. Leopard skins, spotted and supple, were reserved for the priests and kings, while ostrich feathers became symbols of truth and justice, worn in the crowns of pharaohs and placed in the hands of gods. But perhaps most precious of all were the people themselves. The Kushites were renowned throughout the ancient world for their skill and knowledge. They were master archers, so skilled with the bow that Egyptian armies eagerly recruited them as mercenaries. They were accomplished metal workers, capable of smelting iron when much of the world still relied on bronze. They were wise in the ways of medicine and magic, keepers of secrets that had been passed down through generations of healers and priests. The early settlements of Kush were modest affairs, clusters of round houses built from sun-dried brick and stone, their walls decorated with geometric patterns that seemed to capture the rhythm of the Nile itself. But even in these humble dwellings, there were signs of the greatness that was to come. Archaeologists have found evidence of sophisticated pottery, beautifully crafted jewelry, and religious artifacts that speak of a deep spiritual life and an advanced understanding of the divine. As the centuries passed, these small communities began to coalesce around certain centers of power and sacred significance. Kerma, located at the Third Cataract, became the first great capital of Kush, its massive mud brick structures rising like man-made mountains from the desert floor. Here the early kings of Kush held court, surrounded by the wealth of their realm and the loyalty of their people. The relationship between Kush and Egypt during these early centuries was complex and ever-changing. Sometimes the two civilizations existed as trading partners, with Egyptian merchants traveling south to exchange manufactured goods for Nubian gold and ivory. At other times they were bitter enemies, with Egyptian pharaohs launching military campaigns to secure the gold mines and trade routes of the south. There were periods when Egypt dominated Kush directly, establishing fortresses and administrative centers throughout Nubia. Yet even during these times of foreign rule, the Kushite people maintained their distinct identity, their own religious traditions, and their own dreams of independence. What is remarkable about the Kushites is how they absorbed and transformed the influences that came from the north. They adopted many aspects of Egyptian culture, religion, and art. What they did, not simply copy what they saw. Instead, they created something new, a unique synthesis that was neither purely Egyptian nor purely Nubian, but something entirely their own. They learned to read and write in Egyptian hieroglyphs, but they also developed their own script, known today as Meroë, which remains only partially deciphered. They worshipped Egyptian gods like Amun and Isis, but they also honored their own deities, including Apedmak, the lion-headed god of war, and Sebiumeker, the divine protector of the kingdom. They built temples in the Egyptian style, but they decorated them with uniquely Nubian motifs, elephants and giraffes, lions and ostriches, the animals of Africa rendered in stone and paint. The city of Napata, nestled beneath the sacred mountain of Jebel Barkal, gradually emerged as the spiritual and political heart of the kingdom. Here the god Amun was believed to dwell within the mountain itself, speaking to his chosen priests and kings through oracles and dreams. The mountain, with its distinctive flat top and sheer sides, seemed to rise from the desert like a natural pyramid, a sign from the gods that this was indeed a holy place. It was at Napata that the Kushite kings began to style themselves as pharaohs, adopting the full regalia and ceremonial traditions of Egyptian royalty. But they did not do this as mere imitators or pretenders. They believed with genuine conviction that they were the rightful heirs to the pharaonic tradition, that the gods had chosen them to preserve and protect the ancient ways when Egypt itself had grown weak and forgetful. The Kushite pharaohs were deeply religious men and women, more concerned with maintaining the proper relationship between the earthly realm and the divine than with mere political power. They rebuilt temples that had fallen into disrepair, revived religious festivals that had been forgotten, and ensured that the ancient rituals were performed with the precision and reverence they deserved. As evening settles over the land of Kush, as the last light fades from the sacred mountain of Jebel Barkal, we can almost hear the whispers of those ancient voices, the priests chanting in the temples, the people singing their evening prayers, the gentle rustle of palm fronds in the desert breeze. This was a civilization built on patience and wisdom, on the understanding that true power comes not from force, but from righteousness, not from conquest, but from the ability to unite diverse peoples under the banner of common purpose and shared faith. The stage is now set for the remarkable story that follows, the tale of how these desert kings would one day march north, not as conquerors but as saviors, to restore the glory of Egypt and establish a dynasty that would rule both kingdoms with wisdom and justice. But that story must wait for another chapter, as we pause here in the twilight of ancient Nubia, listening to the eternal song of the Nile and feeling the weight of history settling gently around us like a comfortable blanket on a cool desert night. There is perhaps no relationship in all of ancient history quite as complex and fascinating as that between Egypt and Kush, like two rivers that sometimes flow together and sometimes diverge, like two dancers who embrace and then separate only to embrace again. These two great civilizations spent more than 2 millennia in a dance of mutual influence, admiration, conflict, and ultimately unity. To understand this relationship, we must first understand that the ancient world was not divided by the rigid national boundaries that we know today. Instead, the Nile Valley was a living corridor, a highway of culture and commerce that connected the Mediterranean world with the heart of Africa. Merchants, priests, soldiers, and scholars moved freely along this watery path, carrying with them not just goods and gold, but ideas, beliefs, and dreams that in the earliest days, when the pyramids of Giza were still young and the pharaohs of the Old Kingdom ruled from Memphis, Egypt looked upon Nubia much as a wealthy neighbor might regard a promising younger sibling. There was condescension, certainly, but also recognition of potential. Egyptian texts from this period speak of the Nubians as skilled warriors and craftsmen, people worth knowing and, when necessary, worth fighting. The Egyptians called the Nubians Naasi, meaning those who belong to the south, and while this term sometimes carried undertones of superiority, it also conveyed a sense of familiarity and connection. The Nubians were not strangers or barbarians in Egyptian eyes, but rather cousins, members of the same great family that had grown up along the banks of the sacred river. During the Middle Kingdom, roughly 4,000 years ago, this relationship took on a more formal character. Egyptian pharaohs like Amenhotep II and Sesostris III launched military campaigns into Nubia, not primarily to destroy or dominate, but to secure the trade routes and establish a framework for cooperation. The massive fortresses they built at places like Boon and Semna were not just military installations, but administrative centers, places where Egyptian officials worked alongside Nubian chiefs to manage the flow of goods and maintain peace. Yet, even during these periods of Egyptian dominance, the influence flowed both ways. Egyptian soldiers stationed in Nubia married local women and raised bilingual children who moved easily between both cultures. Egyptian priests learned Nubian religious practices and incorporated them into their own rituals. Egyptian artists adopted Nubian motifs and techniques, enriching the visual vocabulary of pharaonic art. The Nubians, for their part, were eager students of Egyptian civilization. They sent their princes to be educated in Egyptian schools where they learned not just the language and customs of the north, but also the deeper mysteries of statecraft and religious practice. These young nobles returned to their homeland as cultural ambassadors, carrying with them the tools and knowledge needed to build a truly sophisticated civilization. Perhaps nowhere is this cultural exchange more beautifully illustrated than in the art of the period. Egyptian tomb paintings began to show Nubian figures not as conquered enemies, but as respected allies, their distinctive features rendered with care and dignity. Nubian princes appear in pharaonic regalia, their dark skin gleaming with gold and precious oils, their bearing proud and confident. Meanwhile, in Nubian art, we see the gradual adoption of Egyptian artistic conventions, but always with a distinctly African flavor that speaks of creative adaptation rather than mere imitation. The relationship was not without its tensions and conflicts. There were times when Egyptian armies marched south in anger, when Nubian raiders struck at Egyptian settlements, when the delicate balance of trade and diplomacy collapsed into violence. But even these conflicts were conducted with a certain restraint, a recognition that the two peoples were bound together by geography, by commerce, and by an increasingly intertwined destiny. One of the most remarkable Aspects of this relationship was how it shaped the identity of both civilizations. Egypt's contact with Nubia forced it to confront questions about race, culture, and power that would have been unthinkable in a more isolated society. The presence of Nubian soldiers in Egyptian armies, Nubian officials in Egyptian government, and Nubian gods in Egyptian temples created a cosmopolitan atmosphere that enriched the entire civilization. For the Nubians, the relationship with Egypt provided access to a vast network of knowledge and culture that stretched from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf. They learned Egyptian medicine and mathematics, Egyptian architecture and engineering, Egyptian literature and philosophy. But they did not simply absorb these influences passively. Instead, they transformed them, creating new syntheses that were neither purely Egyptian nor purely Nubian, but something entirely unique. The turning point in this long relationship came during Egypt's period of weakness and division, what historians call the Third Intermediate Period, as Egyptian central authority crumbled. As the once mighty pharaohs became mere figureheads ruling over petty kingdoms, the Kushites watched from the south with growing concern. They had spent centuries learning to revere Egyptian civilization, to see it as the pinnacle of human achievement. Now they witnessed its decline with the same distress that devoted children might feel watching a beloved parent grow old. And frail God, it was during this period of Egyptian weakness that the Kushites began to see themselves not as subordinates or imitators, but as the rightful heirs to the pharaonic tradition. They had preserved the old ways when Egypt itself had forgotten them. They had maintained the proper relationship with the gods when Egyptian priests had grown lax and corrupt. They had kept alive the dream of unity and order when Egypt itself had dissolved into chaos and civil war. The Kushite kings at Napata began to style themselves as pharaohs, not out of arrogance or ambition, but out of a deep sense of religious duty. They believed that the gods had chosen them to preserve and protect the ancient traditions, to serve as guardians of the sacred order that had made Egypt great. When they looked north toward the divided kingdom of their former masters, they saw not an opportunity for conquest, but a calling to restoration. This was the moment when the student became the teacher, when the younger sibling assumed the role of elder, when the dance between Egypt and Kush entered its most extraordinary phase. The Kushites prepared to march north, not as barbarian invaders, but as legitimate pharaohs, armed with the moral authority of the gods and the deep conviction that they were answering a divine call to restore order to a fallen world. The relationship between Egypt and Kush had always been one of mutual influence and respect, but now it was about to become something even more remarkable, a partnership in which the African South would guide and govern the Mediterranean North, in which Black Pharaohs would wear the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, in which the ancient dream of unity would be fulfilled in ways that no one could have imagined. As we prepare to witness this extraordinary transformation, we can pause to appreciate the remarkable journey that brought these two civilizations to this moment of destiny. What began as a simple relationship between neighbors had evolved into something far more complex and beautiful, a marriage of cultures, a blending of traditions, a partnership that would produce one of the most remarkable dynasties in all of human history. The night wind carries the scent of frankincense and myrrh across the desert. while the Nile flows eternally between its banks, connecting the two lands that were about to become one under the rule of the Black Pharaohs. The dance between Egypt and Kush was about to reach its most graceful and triumphant movement, and we are privileged to witness this moment when history itself seemed to hold its breath in anticipation of wonders yet to come. In the gentle hours before dawn, when the desert air is cool and sweet with the promise of a new day, there is a sacred mountain that rises from the sands like a sleeping giant. Jebel Barkal stands sentinel over the ancient city of Napata, its flat summit catching the first rays of sunlight and casting long shadows across the temples and palaces that nestle at its base. For the people of Kush, this mountain was not merely a geographical feature, but the very dwelling place of the god Amun, the divine presence that would guide their destiny and legitimize their claim to pharaonic power. It was here, in the shadow of this holy mountain, that the transformation of Kush from a regional kingdom into a pharaonic dynasty began in earnest. The year was approximately 750 BCE, and Egypt lay fractured and weak, divided among petty rulers who squabbled over territory, while the great traditions of their ancestors crumbled into neglect. The temples stood empty, their rituals forgotten, or performed with careless haste. The ancient laws that had maintained order for millennia were ignored or corrupted by local strongmen, who cared more for personal gain than divine mandate. From their capital at Napata, the Kushite kings watched this decay with growing alarm and, eventually, with a sense of divine calling. They had spent centuries as devoted students of Egyptian civilization, learning its languages, adopting its customs, and most importantly, embracing its religious traditions with a fervor that often exceeded that of the Egyptians themselves. Now, as they witnessed the spiritual and political collapse of their former teachers, they began to understand that the gods had prepared them for this moment. The transformation did not happen overnight. It began with Kashta, whose name means the Kushite, a ruler who first dared to wear the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt and style himself as pharaoh. But Kashta was a cautious man, content to rule from the south and extend his influence gradually northward. He established diplomatic relations with Egyptian rulers, married his daughter to a Theban prince, and began the delicate process of positioning Kush as the legitimate heir to pharaonic authority. The sacred rituals at Napata during this period were elaborate affairs that combined Egyptian traditions with distinctly Kushite elements. The temple of Amun at Jebel Barkal became the center of these ceremonies, its priests conducting the ancient rites that confirmed the divine nature of kingship. The mountain itself was believed to be a natural pyramid, a sign from the gods that this was indeed the proper place for pharaonic coronation and divine communication. What made the Kushite approach to pharaonic rule so remarkable was their genuine reverence for the traditions they were adopting. Unlike many conquerors who might impose their own customs on a defeated people, the Kushites saw themselves as restorers rather than reformers. They studied the ancient texts with scholarly dedication, consulted with Egyptian priests about proper ritual procedures, and went to extraordinary lengths to ensure that their rule would be seen as legitimate, not just by force of arms, but by divine sanction. The priests at Napata developed an intricate system of oracles and divine consultations that would guide royal decision-making. Before any major undertaking, the king would enter the sacred precincts of the temple, where the voice of Amun would speak through his chosen priests. These were not mere political performances, but genuine religious experiences, moments when the earthly and divine realms were believed to intersect and provide guidance for the welfare of the kingdom. The city of Napata itself reflected this blend of political ambition and religious devotion. The royal palace was built in the Egyptian style, but decorated with distinctly Nubian motifs. Lions and elephants appeared alongside the traditional pharaonic symbols, while the walls were painted with scenes that celebrated both Egyptian mythology and African wildlife. The result was a visual language that spoke to both northern and southern sensibilities, creating a sense of unity that transcended traditional cultural boundaries. As the Kushite kings grew more confident in their role as pharaohs, they began to attract support from unexpected quarters. Egyptian priests, disgusted by the corruption and neglect they witnessed in their own land, began to look southward with hope. They recognized in the Kushite rulers a sincerity and dedication that had been absent from Egyptian leadership for generations. Letters and diplomatic missions began to flow between Napata and various Egyptian cities, creating a network of support that would prove crucial in the events to come. The Kushite court at Napata became a magnet for scholars, artists, and religious figures from throughout the Nile Valley. Here they found patrons who valued learning and tradition, who were willing to invest in the preservation and revival of ancient knowledge. The royal library grew to rival those of Memphis and Thebes, while the workshops of royal artisans produced works that would influence artistic styles throughout the region. But perhaps most importantly, the Kushite pharaohs began to understand that their mission extended beyond mere political control. They saw themselves as guardians of a sacred trust, preservers of a way of life that had been ordained by the gods themselves. This sense of divine mission would give them the moral authority they needed to convince skeptical Egyptians that their rule was not a foreign occupation, but a homecoming, a return to the proper order that had been disrupted by weak and corrupt leadership. The military preparations for the eventual march north were conducted with the same meticulous attention to religious propriety that characterized all aspects of Kushite rule. The armies were blessed by priests, the weapons were sanctified in temple ceremonies, and the entire enterprise was presented not as a conquest, but as a restoration of divine order. The soldiers who would eventually march north understood that they were not merely warriors, but instruments of divine will, chosen to restore the ancient glory of the pharaonic tradition, as the sun sets over the sacred mountain of Jebel Barkal. We can imagine the scene at Napata during those crucial years of preparation. The temple courtyards filled with the sound of prayers and hymns, the royal workshops busy with the creation of regalia and ceremonial objects, the scribes recording the divine oracles that would guide the kingdom's destiny. There was an atmosphere of anticipation and purpose, a sense that great events were about to unfold. The stage was now set for one of the most remarkable chapters in ancient history. The Black Pharaohs of Kush, armed with divine sanction and driven by religious conviction, were about to embark on their mission to restore order to a divided Egypt. They would not come as conquerors, but as saviors, not as destroyers, but as rebuilders, not as foreigners, but as the rightful heirs to a tradition that they had preserved when others had forgotten it. The sacred mountain stands eternal against the star-filled sky, its presence a constant reminder that some things transcend the temporal, struggles of kingdoms and empires. In its shadow, the destiny of two great civilizations was about to be decided, and the world was about to witness the remarkable spectacle of Africa rising to guide and govern the ancient lands of the Pharaohs. There are moments in history when a single individual becomes the vessel through which the dreams and aspirations of an entire people find their expression. Such a moment came with the ascension of Pi to the throne of Kush, a ruler whose very name would become synonymous with a triumphant march of righteousness over chaos, of divine order over earthly corruption. His story is not merely one of conquest and political maneuvering, but of spiritual awakening and the fulfillment of a sacred destiny that had been generations in the making. Pi came to power around 744 BCE, inheriting from his father Kashte, a kingdom that was poised on the brink of greatness. But where Kashta had been cautious and diplomatic, Pi possessed a fierce certainty about his divine mission. He was a man of deep religious conviction, spending long hours in prayer and meditation within the sacred precincts of the Temple of Ammon at Jebel Barkal. It was here, in the shadow of the holy mountain, that he received what he believed to be a direct command from the god himself, to march north and restore the ancient glory of the pharaonic tradition. The Egypt that Pi gazed upon from his southern kingdom was a land divided against itself. The north was controlled by Tefnacht, a Delta prince who had managed to unite several petty kingdoms under his rule, but who lacked the divine sanction that true pharaonic authority required. The south was nominally ruled by various local strongmen who paid lip service to pharaonic tradition, while ignoring its deeper spiritual requirements. Most troubling of all, the great temples lay neglected, their rituals performed half-heartedly, if at all, their priests reduced to mere functionaries rather than the sacred intermediaries they were meant to be. For a man of Pi's deep religious sensibilities, this situation was not merely politically unacceptable, but spiritually intolerable. He had been raised to revere the pharaonic tradition as the earthly manifestation of divine order, the system through which the gods maintained harmony between heaven and earth. To see this sacred institution corrupted and diminished was, in his eyes, to witness the very foundations of civilization crumbling. The preparations for Pi's northern campaign were unlike any military expedition in recorded history. Every aspect of the undertaking was carefully planned according to religious principles and divine guidance. The priests at Napata conducted elaborate ceremonies to ensure that the gods approved of the mission. Sacred objects were carried with the army, transforming the military force into a kind of mobile temple. The soldiers themselves were not merely warriors, but participants in a holy crusade, defenders of the faith marching to restore the proper relationship between the divine and earthly realms. Pi's army began its march north in the flood season, when the Nile was at its highest and most powerful. This timing was not coincidental, but deeply symbolic. Just as the annual flood brought life and renewal to the land, so too would Pi's expedition bring spiritual renewal to Egypt. The army moved slowly and deliberately, stopping at each major temple along the way to perform the proper rituals and demonstrate their commitment to religious orthodoxy. As word of Pi's approach spread through Egypt, the reaction was mixed but telling. Many of the common people, long oppressed by weak and corrupt rulers, began to see the Kushite king as a potential liberator. The priests, in particular, were drawn to Pi's obvious devotion and his commitment to reviving the ancient traditions. Stories began to circulate of miracles and divine signs that accompanied the southern army, evidence that the gods themselves approved of this mission. The first major confrontation came at Hermopolis, where a local ruler named Namlut had declared his loyalty to Tefnakt and the Northern Coalition. But Pi's approach to this siege revealed the unique character of his campaign. Rather than simply overwhelming the city with superior force, he first attempted to win over the defenders through appeals to their religious conscience. He sent messengers to explain his divine mission and to offer clemency to those who would acknowledge his legitimate authority. When diplomacy failed and the siege became necessary, Pi conducted it with scrupulous attention to religious protocol. The army performed daily prayers and sacrifices, seeking divine guidance at every step. When the city finally fell, Pi's treatment of the defeated was remarkably merciful. He spared the lives of his enemies, restored the local temples to their proper function, and made it clear that his goal was not destruction, but restoration. The victory at Hermopolis sent shockwaves throughout Egypt. Here was a conqueror who fought not for personal glory or material gain, but for the restoration of the ancient order. His army was disciplined and devout. His treatment of prisoners was humane, and his commitment to religious tradition was absolute. Even his enemies began to whisper that perhaps the gods had indeed chosen this southern king to restore Egypt to its former glory. As Pi's forces advanced toward Memphis, the ancient capital of Egypt, the symbolism of the moment was not lost on anyone. This was the city where the pharaohs of the Old Kingdom had ruled when the pyramids were built, where the divine kingship had first been established in its full glory. For Pi to claim Memphis would be to claim the very heart of pharaonic legitimacy. The siege of Memphis was the most challenging military operation of the campaign. The city was strongly fortified and well defended, its inhabitants loyal to the Northern Coalition. But Pi's approach was characteristically methodical and ritually appropriate. He established his camp at the traditional locations specified by ancient military texts, performed the proper ceremonies before beginning the siege, and conducted the entire operation according to the sacred protocols that governed pharaonic warfare. The turning point came when Pi performed a remarkable act of religious devotion. Rather than simply storming the city's walls, he first demanded access to the great temple of Ptah, the creator god who was particularly revered in Memphis. When this was granted, Pi entered the temple not as a conqueror, but as a pilgrim, performing the ancient rituals with such obvious sincerity and devotion that even the Memphite priests were moved to tears. Word of this extraordinary scene spread rapidly through the city. Here was a king who valued religious duty over military glory, who sought divine approval before human submission. The defenders of Memphis, already impressed by Pi's merciful treatment of other conquered cities, began to see him not as a foreign invader, but as a rightful pharaoh come to restore the ancient order. When Memphis finally submitted, Pi's treatment of the city established the pattern that would characterize his entire reign. He pardoned his enemies, restored the temples, confirmed the local priests in their positions, and made generous offerings to the gods. His victory celebration was not a military triumph, but a religious festival, with elaborate ceremonies that emphasized his role as a restorer of divine order rather than a mere conqueror. The psychological impact of Pi's victory at Memphis cannot be overstated. The most sacred city in Egypt had acknowledged his authority. Its priests had confirmed his divine sanction, and its people had witnessed his genuine devotion to the ancient traditions. From Memphis, messengers carried word throughout the Nile valley that a true pharaoh had emerged, one who combined military prowess with religious sincerity in ways that had not been seen for generations. The final phase of Pi's campaign was almost anticlimactic. Tefnut and his remaining allies, seeing the writing on the wall, began to submit one by one. But even in victory, Pi remained true to his religious principles. He demanded not just political submission, but spiritual commitment. His defeated enemies were required to undergo purification ceremonies, to pledge their devotion to the ancient traditions, and to demonstrate their commitment to the proper relationship between the divine and earthly realms. The victory stela that Pi erected at Jebel Barkal to commemorate his triumph is one of the most remarkable documents to survive from the ancient world. Written in classical Egyptian hieroglyphs, it presents the entire campaign not as a military conquest, but as a religious restoration. Pi describes himself not as a conqueror, but as an instrument of divine will, chosen by the gods to restore order to a chaotic world. What makes this document so extraordinary is its tone of genuine humility and religious devotion. Pi credits his victories not to his own military genius, but to the favor of the gods. He emphasizes his commitment to mercy and justice, his respect for Egyptian traditions, and his desire to heal rather than harm the land he had conquered. This was not the boastful propaganda of a typical ancient conqueror, but the sincere testimony of a deeply religious man who believed he had been chosen for a sacred mission. As the stars wheel overhead and the night deepens around us, we can imagine Pi, in his moment of triumph, kneeling in the temple of Amun at Jebel Barkal, offering prayers of thanksgiving for the success of his divinely ordained mission. He had achieved something unprecedented in the ancient world, the conquest of a great civilization, not through mere force, but through the power of religious conviction and moral authority. The Lion King of the South had claimed his rightful place as Pharaoh of Egypt, but more than that, he had demonstrated that true kingship comes not from the ability to dominate, but from the wisdom to unite, not from the power to destroy, but from the courage to restore. In the gentle darkness of the African night, with the sacred mountains standing guard over his achievements, Pi had established a new model of royal authority that would influence the ancient world for centuries to come. The morning sun rises over the ancient city of Thebes, casting long golden shadows across the towering columns of Karnak Temple. Here, where the sacred lake reflects the sky like polished silver, we find ourselves in the presence of one of history's most remarkable rulers. His name was Taharka, and he would become the greatest of the Kushite pharaohs, a man who would hold the double crown of Egypt and Kush for 26 years, transforming both kingdoms into a united empire that stretched from the Mediterranean to the heart of Africa. Picture, if you will, the year 690 BCE. The great Pi has passed into the realm of the ancestors. His dream of Kushite rule over Egypt, now a living reality. His successor, Shebitku, has maintained the kingdom's strength, but it is Taharka who will elevate it to heights not seen since the glory days of the new kingdom pharaohs. At 32 years of age, this prince from the southern kingdom of Kush ascends to the throne of the most powerful empire in the ancient world. Taharka was no ordinary ruler. Born in the royal city of Napata, beneath the sacred mountain of Jebel Barkal, he had been groomed from childhood for this moment. The priests of Amun had declared him chosen by the gods, and the people of both Egypt and Kush would come to see the divine favor that seemed to shine upon everything he touched. His was a reign that would be remembered not only for military victories, but for the magnificent temples he would build, the ancient traditions he would restore, and the prosperity he would bring to his dual kingdom dot as the morning light grows. Stronger, we can almost hear the sound of thousands of workers beginning their daily tasks. Stonemasons from Aswan, carpenters from Memphis, goldsmiths from Nubia, all working together under Taharka's vision to create monuments that would stand as testaments to the power and glory of the Kushite dynasty. The pharaoh believed deeply that through grand construction projects he could honor the gods and ensure the eternal prosperity of his people. One of Taharka's first great undertakings was the expansion of the Temple of Amun at Karnak. This sacred complex, already ancient when he came to power, would be transformed under his patronage into something even more magnificent. He commissioned a great colonnade, its massive sandstone pillars rising like a forest of stone toward the heavens. Each column was carved with intricate hieroglyphs telling the story of his divine appointment, his victories in battle, and his pious devotion to the gods. But Taharka's architectural ambitions extended far beyond Thebes. In the city of Kawa, deep in the Nubian heartland, he ordered the construction of a magnificent temple that would rival even the great monuments of Egypt. This temple, dedicated to the god Amun-Ra, was built with the finest materials the empire could provide: gold from the mines of Kush, granite from the quarries of Aswan, and cedar wood from the forests of Lebanon. All found their way into this sacred structure. The temple at Kawa was more than just a place of worship. It was a statement of power, a declaration that the Kushite pharaohs were not merely conquerors but legitimate rulers blessed by the gods. The walls were adorned with scenes showing Taharka making offerings to the deities, receiving the symbols of kingship, and standing as the bridge between the mortal and divine realms. The complex included workshops, granaries, and living quarters for the priests, creating what historians would later call a temple town, a self-sufficient religious community that served as a center of learning and culture as the sun climbs. Higher in the sky, we can imagine the bustling activity that would have filled these temple complexes during Taharka's reign. Scribes copying sacred texts, artists painting murals that told the stories of creation and conquest, musicians practicing hymns that would echo through the halls during religious ceremonies. The pharaoh himself would often be present, overseeing the work, consulting with architects and priests, ensuring that every detail met his exacting standards. But even as Taharka was transforming the spiritual landscape of his empire, storm clouds were gathering on the northern horizon. The Assyrian Empire, that great military machine that had conquered much of the Middle East, was turning its attention toward Egypt. Under King Esarhaddon, the Assyrians had been steadily expanding their territory, and the wealth and strategic importance of Egypt made it an irresistible target. Taharqa, however, was not one to await destruction passively. He understood that the best defense was often a strong offense, and he began to build alliances with the city-states of the Levant, who were also threatened by Assyrian expansion. The king of Tyre, the rulers of various Palestinian territories, all found in Taharqa a powerful ally who could offer military support and the promise of Egyptian gold. The first major confrontation came in 677 BCE, when Esarhaddon launched his invasion of Egypt. The Assyrians, confident in their iron weapons and siege engines, expected to crush the Kushite forces, as they had so many others. But Taharqa had spent years preparing for this moment. He had strengthened the fortifications along Egypt's northeastern border, established military training camps where his soldiers practiced daily running to build endurance, and forged a unified command structure that brought together the best warriors from both Egypt and Kush. The conflict that followed was unlike anything the ancient world had seen. For 4 years, the two empires clashed in a series of battles that stretched from the Sinai Peninsula to the gates of Memphis. Taharqa's forces, fighting on their home territory and motivated by the defense of their sacred land, proved more resilient than the Assyrians had anticipated. The pharaoh himself led from the front, his presence on the battlefield inspiring his troops to feats of heroism that would be remembered in songs and stories for generations. In the end, it was the Assyrians who were forced to retreat. Esarhaddon's invasion had failed, and Taharqa's victory secured his position as one of the most formidable rulers of his time. The pharaoh had proven that the Kushite dynasty was not merely a temporary interruption in Egyptian history, but a legitimate and powerful continuation of the pharaonic tradition. But Taharqa knew that military victory was only part of what made a great ruler. Even as he celebrated his triumph over the Assyrians, he turned his attention once again to the works of peace that he believed would ensure his legacy. He commissioned new additions to the Temple of Mut in Thebes, creating a complex of shrines and courtyards that served as a center for the worship of the divine feminine. He restored ancient monuments that had fallen into decay, seeing himself as the guardian of Egypt's glorious past as well as the architect of its future. One of his most ambitious projects was the restoration and expansion of the religious complex at Jebel Barkal, the holy mountain that had been sacred to the Kushites for centuries. Here, beneath the shadow of the towering sandstone pinnacle that the ancient Nubians believed was the dwelling place of Amun, Taharqa created a series of temples that would serve as the spiritual heart of his southern kingdom. The complex included a great temple to Amun, smaller shrines dedicated to various deities, and elaborate underground chambers where the most sacred rituals were performed. As the afternoon sun reaches its zenith, we might pause to consider the remarkable achievement that Taharqa represented. Here was a man who had been born in the African kingdom of Kush, yet who had become the legitimate pharaoh of Egypt, accepted by the priests of Amun and beloved by the people of both lands. He had successfully defended his empire against the greatest military power of his time, and he had used the peace that victory brought to create monuments that would endure for millennia. But perhaps most importantly, Taharqa had demonstrated that the civilizations of Africa were not peripheral to the ancient world, but central to it. His reign showed that the Black Pharaohs of Kush were not merely conquerors, but inheritors and guardians of one of humanity's greatest cultural traditions. They built upon the achievements of their predecessors while adding their own unique contributions to the magnificent tapestry of ancient civilization. The temples that Taharqa built were not just monuments to his own glory, but expressions of a worldview that saw the divine in the natural world, that understood kingship as a sacred responsibility, and that viewed the proper relationship between ruler and ruled as one of mutual obligation and respect. His inscriptions speak of his duty to feed the hungry, protect the weak, and maintain the cosmic order that the Egyptians called Ma at Dot. As the day begins to wane and the shadows grow longer, we can imagine Taharqa himself walking through the halls of his great temple at Karnak, inspecting the work of his craftsmen, consulting with his priests about the proper performance of rituals, and planning new projects that would further glorify the gods and benefit his people. He was a man who understood that true power came not from the ability to destroy, but from the capacity to create, to build, to leave the world more beautiful and more just than he had found it. The reign of Taharqa would last for 26 years, a remarkably long time in an age when many rulers met violent ends after only a few years on the throne. During that time he would face other challenges, including further conflicts with the Assyrians, internal rebellions, and the eternal struggle to maintain unity between his Egyptian and Kushite subjects. But through it all, he would remain committed to his vision of a united empire that honored both the ancient traditions of Egypt and the proud heritage of Kush. His building projects would continue throughout his reign, each one more ambitious than the last. He would add to the temple complexes at Memphis and Tanis, create new shrines in cities throughout his empire, and commission countless statues and reliefs that depicted him performing the ancient rituals of kingship. These works of art, many of which survive to this day, show us a ruler who was confident in his divine appointment, yet humble before the gods, powerful in his authority, yet careful to observe the proper forms and ceremonies that legitimized his rule. As evening approaches, and the first stars begin to appear in the darkening sky, we might reflect on the lessons that Taharqa's reign offers us. Here was a man who faced seemingly impossible challenges, who was asked to unite two ancient civilizations, to defend his empire against the greatest military power of his age, and to maintain the delicate balance between tradition and innovation that successful rulership requires. He met these challenges not with brutality or oppression, but with wisdom, vision, and an unwavering commitment to the welfare of his people. The story of Taharqa reminds us that greatness is not measured merely by the extent of one's conquests or the size of one's treasury, but by the lasting contributions one makes to human civilization. His temples still stand, testaments to the skill of his craftsmen and the grandeur of his vision. His inscriptions still speak to us across the millennia, telling us of a ruler who understood that the greatest monuments are not built of stone, but of the good that one does in the world. Tonight, as we prepare for sleep, we can take comfort in the knowledge that there have been rulers like Taharqa, men and women who understood that leadership is a sacred trust, that power is a responsibility rather than a privilege, and that the true measure of a life well lived is not what one takes from the world, but what one gives to it. In the quiet darkness, we can almost hear the whispered prayers of the ancient priests, the gentle lapping of the Nile against the temple walls, and the eternal promise that those who build with love and wisdom create works that will endure long. After their earthly lives have ended, the reign of Taharqa was a golden age for both Egypt and Kush, a time when the two great civilizations of the Nile Valley were united under a single crown, when art and architecture flourished, and when the ancient world witnessed the power and majesty of Africa's greatest kingdoms. His story is one of triumph over adversity, of the victory of vision over violence, and of the enduring power of those who choose to build rather than destroy. As we close this chapter of our journey through the Kingdom of Kush, we carry with use the image of Taharqa standing in his great temple at Karnak, the double crown of Egypt and Kush upon his head, the favor of the gods shining upon him, and the grateful prayers of his people rising like incense to the heavens. He was the builder and guardian of empire, the pharaoh who proved that the black kings of Kush were worthy inheritors of the throne of the pharaohs, and his legacy reminds us that true greatness lies not in the power to conquer, but in the wisdom to create, to preserve, and to leave the world a more beautiful place than we found it. The gentle evening breeze carries the scent of frankincense across the courtyards of Meroë, where artisans work by the light of oil lamps, their skilled hands creating wonders that speak of a civilization unlike any other in the ancient world. Here, where the blue and white Niles converge in their eternal dance toward the Mediterranean, we witness the flowering of a culture that was neither purely Egyptian nor wholly African, but something altogether magnificent in its own right. Kingdom of Kush developed a unique culture that blended Egyptian, African, and Mediterranean influences, creating artistic traditions that would endure for over 3 millennia. Picture, if you will, the walls of the great temples rising from the desert sands, their surfaces alive with scenes that tell a story of cultural fusion and creative innovation. The hieroglyphs carved into these ancient stones speak in the familiar language of Egypt, yet they tell uniquely Kushite stories, celebrate distinctly Nubian victories, and honor gods that were born from the marriage of two great civilizations. Artists of Kush were master storytellers, and their preferred medium was the temple wall. As we walk through the sacred precincts of Jebel Barkal, in our imagination, we can see how they transformed the austere religious art of Egypt into something warmer, more vibrant, more alive with human emotion. The pharaohs depicted here are not the distant, godlike figures of Egyptian tradition, but rulers who smile, who gesture with warmth, who seem to breathe with life even as they perform the eternal rituals of kingship. The colors they chose tell us much about the Kushite aesthetic. Where Egyptian artists favored the cool blues and whites that spoke of the ordered cosmos, Kushite painters embraced the warm earth tones of their homeland. Rich ochres and deep browns, golden yellows that captured the light of the African sun, and brilliant reds that spoke of the iron-rich soil of Nubia. These colors were not merely decorative choices, but profound statements about identity, about the beauty they saw in their own landscape and their own people. One of the most striking aspects of Kushite religious art was how it portrayed the divine, often depicted as a figure with a male human torso and a lion head. Apedmak was a war god worshipped by the Meroitic peoples inhabiting Kush. This powerful deity represented something entirely new in the religious landscape of the ancient world. While the Egyptians certainly had their own lion-headed deities, Apidmak was distinctly Kushite in his fierce protective energy and his role as guardian of the southern kingdom. The temples dedicated to Apidmak, particularly the magnificent complex at Naka, show us how Kushite architects adapted Egyptian temple design to serve their own religious needs. The massive stone walls are covered with reliefs showing the lion-headed god and various aspects of his power. Here he stands as protector of the royal family, his muscular form radiating strength and authority. There he appears as the bringer of victory in battle, his lion's mane flowing like flames around his noble head. And in the most sacred chambers, he is shown as the bridge between the mortal and divine realms, his human torso speaking of his connection to humanity, while his lion's head proclaims his divine nature. But the culture of Kush was not merely about adapting Egyptian traditions to African sensibilities. It was also about creating something entirely new, something that spoke to the unique position of the Kushite people as inheritors of both the ancient wisdom of Egypt and the vibrant traditions of Inner Africa. This cultural synthesis is perhaps nowhere more evident than in the realm of language and writing. The Meroitic script is an alphabetic script originally derived from Egyptian hieroglyphs, used to write the Meroitic language of the Kingdom of Meroë Kush. This remarkable innovation represents one of the earliest known alphabetic writing systems in Africa, and its development speaks to the intellectual sophistication of Kushite civilization. The script itself is beautiful to behold, with its flowing lines and elegant curves that seem to dance across the stone surfaces where they are carved. What makes the Meroitic script particularly fascinating is how it represents a complete departure from the hieroglyphic tradition from which it emerged. While Egyptian hieroglyphs were primarily logographic, representing entire words or concepts, the Meroitic alphabet was truly phonetic, with each symbol representing a sound rather than a meaning. This innovation made literacy more accessible and allowed for the recording of the spoken Meroitic language in all its nuanced complexity. The religious practices of Kush also show this same creative blending of traditions. Kushite religion primarily worshipped deities such as Amun, Mut, and Osiris, often incorporating elements from Egyptian mythology. Yet they transformed these borrowed gods into something uniquely their own. The great temple of Amun at Jebel Barkal, for instance, was built into the living rock of the holy mountain, creating a sacred space that seemed to emerge organically from the landscape itself. The religious calendar of Kush was filled with festivals that combined Egyptian ritual observances with celebrations that were purely African in origin. During the annual flood season, when the Nile brought life to the desert, the people would gather in the temple courtyards to perform dances that had been passed down through generations of Nubian ancestors. These celebrations honored not only the traditional gods of Egypt, but also the spirits of the land itself, the ancestors who had walked these paths before, and the natural forces that govern the rhythm of life in the desert. Music played a central role in Kushite religious and cultural life. Archaeological evidence suggests that the people of Kush were skilled musicians who created instruments that combined Egyptian and African traditions. Harps and lyres, familiar from Egyptian tomb paintings, were played alongside drums and percussion. instruments that spoke of the deeper African heritage of the Kushite people. The music they created was complex and sophisticated, capable of expressing both the solemn dignity of religious ritual and the joyful celebration of life's blessings. The artistic traditions of Kush also extended into the realm of decorative arts and craftsmanship. Kushite jewelers were renowned throughout the ancient world for their skill in working with gold, that precious metal that flowed from the mines of Nubia in seemingly endless abundance. The jewelry they created was not merely decorative but deeply symbolic, incorporating religious motifs and royal iconography that spoke of the wearer's status and spiritual beliefs. The famous golden jewelry found in Kushite tombs shows a level of artistry that rivals anything produced in Egypt or the Mediterranean world. Delicate filigree work, intricate granulation, and sophisticated techniques for working with precious stones all speak to a tradition of craftsmanship that was both highly skilled and deeply rooted in cultural meaning. The crowns and diadems of the Kushite queens, in particular, represent some of the finest examples of ancient goldworking, combining technical excellence with artistic vision in ways that continue to inspire admiration today. Pottery and ceramics also flourished under Kushite patronage, with artisans developing distinctive styles that combined Egyptian forms with African decorative traditions. The pottery of Kush is characterized by its warm earth tones, its organic shapes that seem to flow like the curves of desert dunes, and its surface decorations that speak of both religious devotion and aesthetic sophistication. Many pieces feature images of animals that were sacred to the Kushite people: lions and elephants, ibises and crocodiles, all rendered with a naturalistic style that captures not just their physical appearance, but something of their spiritual essence. The architecture of Kush represents perhaps the most visible expression of this cultural synthesis. Kushites also created pyramids, mud brick temples, tufufa, and masonry temples, yet each of these building types was adapted to serve distinctly Kushite needs and aesthetic preferences. The pyramids of Kush, for instance, are smaller and steeper than their Egyptian counterparts, their proportions speaking of a different understanding of the relationship between earthly and divine realms. The temples of Kush show an even more striking departure from Egyptian norms. While they maintain the basic axial plan of Egyptian temple design, with their sequence of courtyards and halls leading to the sacred sanctuary, they are decorated with a warmth and humanity that is distinctly Kushite. The walls are covered with scenes of daily life, showing the people of Kush engaged in the activities that define their civilization: trading, farming, crafting, celebrating, and worshiping their gods. As we move through these imagined temple spaces, we are struck by the way light plays across the carved surfaces, creating patterns of shadow and illumination that seem to bring the ancient scenes to life. The artists of Kush understood the power of light as a design element, and they used it to create spaces that were not merely functional, but truly transcendent, places where the boundary between the human and divine worlds seemed to dissolve. Intellectual life of Kush was equally rich and complex. The royal libraries of Meroë contain thousands of scrolls and texts written in both Egyptian hieroglyphs and the Meroitic script that preserve the wisdom of ages. These collections included not only religious texts and royal annals, but also works of literature, philosophy, and scientific observation that speak to the sophisticated intellectual culture of the Kushite elite. During the Meroitic period in Nubian history, the Nubians used a trigonometric methodology similar to the Egyptians, demonstrating their mastery of mathematical and engineering principles. This technical knowledge was applied not only to the construction of their magnificent monuments, but also to the development of irrigation systems, the planning of cities, and the creation of trade networks that linked the resources of inner Africa with the markets of the Mediterranean world. The educational system of Kush was designed to preserve and transmit this cultural wealth to future generations. Young nobles were sent to schools attached to the great temples, where they learned not only to read and write, but also to understand the complex religious and philosophical traditions that underpinned their civilization. These schools were centers of learning that attracted students from across the ancient world, making Kush a destination for those seeking wisdom and knowledge. As our journey through Kushite culture draws to a close, we are left with an impression of a civilization that was both deeply rooted in tradition and remarkably innovative in its approach to cultural expression. The people of Kush created a world that honored the past while embracing the future, that celebrated their African heritage while participating fully in the cosmopolitan culture of the ancient Mediterranean. Their legacy reminds us that culture is not a fixed entity, but a living, breathing thing that grows and changes through the creative efforts of each generation. The artists and craftsmen, the priests and scholars, the musicians and architects of Kush all contributed to a cultural flowering that enriched not only their own civilization, but the entire ancient world. In their temples and palaces, in their art and literature, and their music and their dreams, we see reflected the eternal human desire to create beauty, to express meaning, and to leave the world a more beautiful place than we found it. Tonight, as we prepare for sleep, we carry use the images of Kushite culture, the golden jewelry glinting in the lamplight, the painted walls alive with color and motion, the sound of harps and drums echoing through temple courtyards, and the quiet satisfaction of craftsmen who knew that their work would endure long after they had joined their ancestors in the eternal kingdoms of the West. In these memories we find not just the story of an ancient civilization, but a reminder of the power of human creativity to transcend the boundaries of time and space, bringing beauty and meaning into the world through the alchemy of art and imagination. As the golden sun begins its descent toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across the Sudanese desert, we find ourselves standing before one of the most remarkable yet forgotten architectural wonders of the ancient world. Here, where the desert winds whisper secrets through the weathered stones, rise the pyramids of Meroë, a necropolis that served as a final resting place for the royalty of Kush for nearly 6 centuries. Unlike their more famous cousins at Giza, the pyramids of Meroë tell a distinctly different story. These monuments, numbering over 200 in total, stand as testament to a civilization that created its own unique interpretation of the eternal journey to the afterlife. The Meroë pyramids date to the later stage of the Kingdom of Kush, 3rd century BCE, 4th century CE, and were burial places for Kushite monarchs, other members of the royal family, and important officials and dignitaries. The approach to Meroë is breathtaking in its stark beauty. As travelers emerge from the desert mirages, they are greeted by the sight of dozens of steep-sided pyramids rising from the golden sands, like ancient sentinels guarding the secrets of the dead. The northern area today contains the best preserved. Of the pyramids at Meroë, some of the most impressive tombs here, the final resting places for 30 kings, 8 queens, and 3 princes. These structures, though smaller than the great pyramids of Egypt, possess a dignity and grace that speaks to the refined aesthetic sensibilities of their builders. The pyramids of Meroë are distinguished by their remarkably steep angle of construction, rising at approximately 70 degrees from the desert floor. This dramatic inclination gives them a soaring quality that seems to lift the eye and spirit skyward, as if the very stones themselves were reaching toward the eternal realms. The builders of these monuments understood that death was not an ending, but a transformation, and their architectural choices reflect this profound spiritual understanding. The Kushite religious system was heavily influenced by Egyptian beliefs, including the worship of Amun and the practice of mummification, yet the pyramids of Meroë show distinctly Kushite innovations in their design and decoration. The chapel attached to each pyramid, where the living could come to honor the deceased, was decorated with reliefs that combined Egyptian religious iconography with scenes of distinctly Nubian life. These carved walls tell stories of lion hunts in the African savanna, of trade expeditions that brought exotic goods from the heart of the continent, and of religious ceremonies that blended ancient traditions with local customs. The most remarkable aspect of the Meroë necropolis is the prominent role it gives to the burial places of queens. In most ancient civilizations, the tombs of female rulers were smaller and less elaborate than those of their male counterparts. But at Meroë, the pyramids of the Kandakes, the powerful queen mothers of Kush, rival those of the kings in their grandeur and complexity. This architectural equality reflects the unique position that women held in Kushite society, where they could rule in their own right and were revered as the embodiment of divine feminine power. During the Meroitic era, strong female rulers were of equal status to male rulers and a central part of government. The role of a Kandake or Candace was a powerful position, and their pyramids stand as monuments to their authority and spiritual significance. The tomb of Queen Amanishakheto, one of the most powerful Kandakes of the 1st century BCE, exemplifies this tradition. In one tomb belonging to Queen Amanishakheto, he discovered a rich hoard of jewelry, though much of the original burial wealth was unfortunately lost to early treasure hunters. The story of the Kandakes is one of the most fascinating aspects of Kushite civilization. In Meroitic cursive, she is referred to as Amanishakheto Kur K D K, which means Amanishakheto, Kur and Kandake ruler and queen. These women were not merely ceremonial figures, but active rulers who led armies, conducted diplomacy, and managed the complex affairs of state. Their pyramids, therefore, were not just tombs, but symbols of the continuing power of the feminine divine in Kushite culture. Perhaps the most famous of these royal women was Queen Amanirenas, queen regnant of the Kingdom of Kush from mid to late 1st century BCE. She is known for invading Roman-occupied Egypt and successfully negotiating the end of Roman retaliation, retaining Kushite independence. She is depicted as a courageous queen, blind in one eye and a skilled negotiator, and her pyramid at Meroë stands as a monument to her remarkable achievements. The construction of these pyramids required extraordinary skill and organization. The builders had to transport massive blocks of sandstone across the desert, shape them with precision using tools of bronze and iron, and position them with mathematical accuracy that ensured the structures would stand for millennia. The internal chambers were carved with the same attention to detail, creating spaces that were both functional and beautiful, designed to serve as eternal dwelling places for the royal souls on their journey through the afterlife. The decorative programs of the Meroë pyramids show the sophisticated artistic culture of the Kushite elite. Queen Shenekata Keto's Pyramid Beg, N11, eastern portion of north wall, showing rite of leading in the calves taken from temple scenes and the judgment. Before Osiris, these reliefs combine Egyptian religious motifs with scenes that are uniquely Kushite, creating a visual narrative that speaks to the complex cultural identity of the kingdom. The pyramid complexes were not isolated monuments, but part of larger ritual landscapes that included processional ways, offering chapels, and subsidiary buildings for the support staff who maintained the cults of the dead rulers. During the major religious festivals, these necropolises would have been alive with activity as priests performed the daily rituals. Families came to honor their ancestors, and pilgrims journeyed from across the kingdom to pay their respects to the royal dead. The archaeological evidence from Meroë reveals a civilization that was both materially prosperous and spiritually sophisticated. The burial goods found in the pyramids include jewelry of extraordinary craftsmanship, weapons decorated with precious metals, and religious objects that speak to the complex theological beliefs of the Kushite people. These artifacts tell us that death was viewed not as an ending, but as a transformation, a passage to a different form of existence where the deceased continued to play an active role in the welfare of the living. The building of the pyramids continued for centuries, with each generation of rulers adding their own monuments to the growing city of the dead. Meroë, 150 miles north of Khartoum, served as a necropolis for the kings and queens of Kush for close to 600 years. This continuity of construction created a physical chronicle of the kingdom's history, with the changing styles of architecture and decoration reflecting the evolving culture and political circumstances of the Kushite state. The later pyramids show increasing influence from the Roman world as Kush became more closely connected to the Mediterranean trade networks. Yet even as they adopted new artistic motifs and building techniques, the Kushite builders maintained their distinctive aesthetic vision. The pyramids of the later period are still recognizably Kushite in their proportions and decoration, proof of the enduring strength of local cultural traditions. The decline of pyramid building at Meroë coincided with the gradual weakening of the Kushite kingdom in the later centuries of the first millennium CE. As the political power of the rulers waned, so too did their ability to command the resources necessary for these grand construction projects. The last pyramids at Meroë were built in the 4th century CE, marking the end of a tradition that had lasted for nearly 1,000 years. Today, the pyramids of Meroë stand as silent witnesses to the grandeur of a civilization that has largely faded from popular memory. As the site of royal burials, most notable are the more than 200 Kushite pyramids that have survived. The desert winds have worn away much of their original decoration, and time has brought down some of the smaller structures, but the essential dignity of these monuments remains undiminished. Standing among these ancient tombs as the sun sets over the Sudanese desert, we are reminded of the universal human desire to create something lasting, something that will speak to future generations about the values and aspirations of those who came before. The pyramids of Meroë are not merely architectural achievements, but expressions of a worldview that saw death as a transition rather than an end, that honored the feminine divine as well as the masculine, and that understood kingship as a sacred responsibility that extended beyond the boundaries of mortal life. The queens who lie beneath these pyramids were not passive figures, but active participants in the great drama of ancient history. They led armies, negotiated treaties, patronized the arts, and maintained the complex religious traditions that gave meaning to their civilization. Their pyramids stand as monuments not only to their individual achievements, but to the remarkable culture that produced them, a culture that gave women a degree of power and respect that was unusual in the ancient world. As night falls over the necropolis, the pyramids take on an almost mystical quality, their dark silhouettes outlined against the star-filled sky. In the gentle desert breeze, we can almost hear the whispered prayers of the ancient priests, the soft footsteps of mourners coming to honor their dead, and the eternal promise that those who build with wisdom and love create monuments that will endure long after their earthly journey has ended. The pyramids of Meroë remind us that every civilization, no matter how remote or forgotten, has contributed something valuable to the human story. In their steep-sided elegance, in their sophisticated decoration, in their testament to the power of women as well as men, these monuments speak to us across the centuries of values and achievements that deserve to be remembered and honored. They are, in the truest sense, a cemetery of queens, a place where the powerful women of Kush rest. In dignity and splendor, their pyramids standing as eternal witnesses to their remarkable lives and enduring influence on the course of human history. Tonight, as we prepare for our own rest, we carry with us the image of these ancient pyramids rising from the desert sands, their weathered stones still reaching toward the heavens, still speaking to us of the eternal human desire to create beauty, to honor the dead, and to leave behind monuments that will inspire and instruct future generations. In their silent majesty, we find not just the story of a vanished kingdom, but a reminder of the enduring power of human achievement to transcend the boundaries of time and mortality. In the gentle embrace of twilight, as the African sun settles behind the ancient pyramids of Meroë, we find ourselves drawn to one of the most remarkable aspects of Kushite civilization. Here in this land where the Nile's waters have flowed for countless millennia, there existed something extraordinary, something that set the Kingdom of Kush apart from all other ancient realms. The evening breeze carries whispers of a title that once commanded respect across the known world, Kandake. The word itself seems to dance on the wind, a name that spoke of power, wisdom, and divine authority. For in the Kingdom of Kush, women did not merely influence from behind palace walls or serve as silent consorts to mighty kings. They ruled. They commanded armies. They negotiated with Rome itself. As we settle into the soft sands of this ancient narrative, let us journey back to a time when the title of Kandake held sway over one of Africa's greatest civilizations. Picture, if you will, the royal palace at Meroë, its walls adorned with vibrant paintings depicting scenes of triumph and ceremony. The air is thick with the scent of frankincense and myrrh, while the gentle sound of water fountains mingles with the distant murmur of the great city beyond. The Kandake was not simply a queen. She was the embodiment of divine feminine power, a bridge between the earthly realm and the gods themselves. The Kandake also held religious significance as a high priestess and mediator between the earthly realm and the divine. She played a central role in religious ceremonies and rituals, overseeing the worship of the Kushite gods and goddesses dot in the cool shadows of the palace chambers. We can almost see her now, draped in the finest silks, her dark skin gleaming, with oils perfumed with rare spices. Golden bracelets encircle her wrists, each one telling a story of conquest or diplomacy. Her eyes, sharp with intelligence and compassion, survey the kingdom that looks to her for guidance. The institution of the Kandake emerged from the deep roots of Kushite tradition, where matrilineal succession meant that royal bloodlines flowed through the female line. In some cases, she may have been sister or close female relative of the king of Kush, and due to matrilineal succession, could play a central role in royal inheritance, making her a queen mother. This was not merely a political arrangement, it was a recognition of the sacred feminine principle that the Kushites believed governed the natural order dot as the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky above the desert. We can imagine the Kandake, in her private moments, perhaps walking through the royal gardens where date palms sway gently in the evening breeze. The weight of her responsibilities is evident in her measured steps, yet there is grace in her bearing that speaks of generations of royal breeding and divine blessing. The power of the Kandake extended far beyond what we might expect from ancient queens. They could own their own land, conduct their own business, and were basically entirely independent women. Allegedly, their influence was so great that if the ruling king displeased them, they could order him to commit ritual suicide, after which she would promote another successor or take the power for herself. This was power in its most absolute form, yet it was tempered by wisdom and spiritual responsibility. Consider the remarkable Queen Shanaktakhet, who reigned from 177 to 155 BCE, the earliest known queen to rule the Kingdom of Kush. Shanaktakhet ruled from 177 BCE to 155 BCE, and did so without a king by her side. In the relief carvings that survive from her reign, we see her depicted not as a delicate flower protected by male guardians, but as a powerful sovereign in her own right, commanding the respect of nobles and commoners alike. The evening deepens, and we can almost hear the gentle lapping of the Nile against the palace quays. In the distance, temple bells chime softly, calling the faithful to evening prayers. It is in this sacred atmosphere that we come to understand the true nature of the Kandake's authority. She was not merely a political leader, she was a spiritual guide, a living connection to the divine forces that the Kushites believed shaped their world. Under the rule of these remarkable women, the Kingdom of Kush experienced what many historians consider its golden age. Under the rule of the Kandakes, Kush blossomed and became even wealthier and more powerful than ever before, leading to what is often called the Golden Age of Kush. Trade flourished along the Nile, bringing precious goods from the heart of Africa to the Mediterranean world. Gold and ivory, exotic animals, and rare spices all flowed through the kingdom under the watchful eye of the Kandake. Imagine the great throne room of Meroë, its walls decorated with scenes of the Kandake receiving tribute from distant lands. The gentle flicker of oil lamps casts dancing shadows on the painted figures, bringing them to life in the dim light. Here the Kandake would hold court, dispensing justice with a wisdom that was said to come directly from the gods themselves. The religious duties of the Kandake were as important as her political ones. Their involvement in ceremonies helped legitimize their power and maintain religious traditions. Key aspects of their religious leadership include leading or presiding over important rituals and festivals, acting as representatives of the divine for the community. She would rise before dawn to perform the sacred rituals that ensured the favor of the gods, her voice joining the morning prayers that drifted across the awakening city dot as we drift deeper into this ancient world. We can visualize the Kandake in her role as high priestess, dressed in ceremonial robes of white linen, with a golden diadem upon her brow. She would approach the altar where offerings of grain and wine awaited the gods. The smoke of incense would rise around her like a prayer made visible, carrying her petitions to the divine realm. The artwork that has survived from the era of the Kandakes tells us much about how they were perceived by their subjects. In these the queen often towers, sometimes in the throes of smiting her enemy. In others her hands are lifted in religious devotion. These were not passive figures relegated to domestic spheres. They were active participants in the great drama of statecraft and warfare. Consider the legendary Queen Amenarines, who reigned in the 1st century BCE. She is most revered for leading the Kushite armies to victory against the Romans after a 5-year war. Picture her, if you will, standing before her assembled troops, her voice carrying clearly across the ranks as she prepares them for battle. The desert wind whips her royal robes around her as she raises her sword, not merely a ceremonial weapon, but a tool of war she knew how to wield. The night deepens around us, and the sounds of the ancient world grow softer. In the palace chambers, oil lamps burn low, casting a warm glow on the faces of sleeping children and the gentle features of their royal mother. For the Kandake was not only a warrior and a priestess, she was often a mother, balancing the demands of family with the responsibilities of empire. That the legacy of the Kandakes extended far beyond their own lifetimes. The institution of the Kandake is an important aspect of Kushite culture and identity. The queens who held this title were revered as symbols of strength, wisdom, and divine authority, and their legacy continues to be celebrated in the modern-day Sudanese cultural landscape. Even today, thousands of years after their reigns ended, their memory lives on in the stories passed down through generations. As the moon rises over the ancient pyramids of Meroë, we can imagine the Kandake in her final moments of the day. Perhaps she stands on the palace balcony looking out over the kingdom she is sworn to protect. The night air carries the scent of jasmine from the royal gardens, while the distant sound of the Nile provides a constant, soothing rhythm. Her jewels have been set aside for the night, but her authority remains undiminished. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, new decisions to be made, new ceremonies to perform. But for now, in this peaceful moment between day and night, she allows herself to simply be a woman of extraordinary power and responsibility, taking a brief respite from the weight of crown and scepter. The Kandaks ruled not through fear or force alone, but through a combination of wisdom, spiritual authority, and genuine care for their people. They understood that true power came not from domination, but from service to the gods, to the kingdom, and to the generations yet to come. In the gentle silence of the desert night, we can almost hear the whispered prayers of the Kandak as she prepares for sleep. Her words drift across the centuries, carrying with them the hopes and dreams of a great civilization. She prays for the prosperity of her people, for the protection of her kingdom, and for the wisdom to rule with justice and compassion. The Kandaks of Kush remind us that power can be wielded with grace, that strength can be tempered with wisdom, and that true leadership comes from a deep understanding of our responsibilities to others. The stars wheel overhead in their eternal dance, the same stars that once shone down on the palaces of Meroë and the temples of Napata. In their light, the legacy of the Kandaks continues to shine, a testament to the enduring power of women who dared to rule, to lead, and to leave their mark on the pages of history. Let us rest now, comforted by the knowledge that in the ancient Kingdom of Kush, women ruled with wisdom and strength, their voices echoing across the centuries to remind us that power, when wielded with love and justice, can indeed transform the world. The moon rises now over the silent sands of Meroë, casting its silver light across the weathered stones of a civilization that once commanded the respect of the ancient world. We have journeyed together through the golden age of Kush, witnessed the triumph of Black Pharaohs, and marveled at the splendor of their royal courts. But every empire, no matter how mighty, must eventually face the turning of time's wheel. As we settle into this gentle evening of our story, let us explore the twilight years of the Kingdom of Kush, when the great cities began to quiet there. Voices in the desert slowly reclaimed the monuments of glory. This is not merely a tale of decline, but a meditation on the eternal cycle of rise and fall that governs all human endeavors. Picture, if you will, the year 300 Common Era, the Ramong Empire. That great northern power was beginning to feel the weight of its own vastness. In the east, a new kingdom was rising in the Ethiopian highlands, the ambitious realm of Axum. And in the heart of Africa, along the life-giving Nile, the Kingdom of Kush was entering its final chapter. The signs of change had been gathering, like storm clouds on the horizon for decades. The great trade routes that had once brought wealth flowing into Meroë were shifting. Roman merchants, who had long valued the exotic goods of the south, were finding new paths to the treasures of India and the Far East. The Red Sea ports, controlled by the rising Axumite kingdom, were drawing commerce away from the Nile Valley. In Meroë itself, the sounds of the royal workshops grew fainter. The skilled goldsmiths, whose intricate jewelry had once adorned the necks of pharaohs, found fewer commissions for their art. The iron forges that had produced the weapons and tools that made Kush a power to be reckoned with began to cool. The very lifeblood of the kingdom, its control of trade between sub-Saharan Africa and the Mediterranean world, was slowly being redirected elsewhere. The royal court, once a center of learning and diplomatic activity, grew smaller and more insular. The great inscriptions that had proclaimed the deeds of mighty rulers became fewer and simpler. The last known royal inscription in the Meroitic script, that beautiful writing system that had set Kush apart from its neighbors, was carved sometime in the early 4th century. After that, silence fell like a curtain across the literary achievements of 1,000 years. But the decline was not sudden, like the fall of a great tree in a storm. Instead, it was gradual, like the gentle erosion of a river bank over many seasons. The people of Kush did not simply vanish into the desert winds. They adapted, as human beings always do, to the changing circumstances of their world. As the power of the central government weakened, local communities became more self-reliant. The great unified kingdom that had once stretched from the borders of Egypt to the tropical regions of the south began to fragment into smaller, more manageable units. Villages that had once sent tribute to Meroë now governed themselves. The elaborate bureaucracy that had administered the vast territories of Kush gradually simplified into more basic forms of local leadership. The religious practices that had bound the kingdom together also began to evolve. The great temples of Amun at Napata, where kings had once received divine blessing, fell into disrepair. The priests who had maintained the elaborate rituals of state religion found their congregations dwindling. Yet the spiritual traditions of Kush did not disappear entirely. They transformed, blending with local beliefs and practices, creating new forms of faith that would survive long after the political structure of the kingdom had crumbled. The physical infrastructure of the kingdom told its own story of gradual decline. The great pyramids of Meroë, those steep-sided monuments to royal power, were last built in the middle of the 4th century. The skilled architects and engineers who had designed these magnificent structures found their services no longer required. The quarries that had provided the stone for monuments and temples grew quiet. The canals and irrigation systems that had made the desert bloom with agriculture were left to fill with sand. Yet even in decline, the kingdom of Kush retained something of its former dignity. The archaeological evidence suggests that life continued in the cities and towns, albeit on a smaller scale. Pottery continued to be made, though in simpler styles. Tools and weapons were still forged, though perhaps not with the same technical sophistication as in the Golden Age. The people of Kush, those descendants of the pharaohs who had once ruled Egypt, maintained their communities and their culture even as the great political edifice around them slowly crumbled. The final blow to the kingdom came not from a single catastrophic event, but from the convergence of several pressures. The Aksumite kingdom to the east, flush with the wealth of Red Sea trade, began to expand its influence into traditional Kushite territory. The nomadic peoples of the desert, the Blemis and the Noba, pressed against the settled communities of the Nile Valley. The Remang Empire, preoccupied with its own internal struggles, withdrew its commercial interest from the region. Most significantly, the environment itself seemed to turn against the kingdom. The climate of the region became increasingly arid. The life-giving rains that had sustained the agriculture of the south became less reliable. The great forests that had provided timber for construction and fuel for the iron forges began to thin. The very foundation of Kushite prosperity, its ability to transform the natural resources of the region into wealth and power, was being eroded. By forces beyond human control, by the middle of the 4th century, the great capital of Meroë was largely abandoned. The royal palaces, where kings and queens had once held court, stood empty. The workshops and marketplaces that had bustled with activity fell silent. The temples where priests had once performed the ancient rituals echoed only with the whisper of desert winds. But the story of Kush did not end with the abandonment of its capital. The people who had built this great civilization carried their knowledge, their skills, and their cultural traditions with them as they dispersed throughout the Nile Valley and beyond. The iron-working techniques that had made Kush famous spread throughout sub-Saharan Africa. The artistic traditions that had flourished in the royal workshops influenced the decorative arts of neighboring peoples. The political and social structures that had governed the kingdom provided models for the smaller states that rose from its ashes. In the centuries that followed, new kingdoms would arise in the region. The Christian kingdoms of Nubia would build upon the foundations laid by Kush, creating their own magnificent civilization along the Nile. The Islamic kingdoms that came later would incorporate elements of Kushite tradition into their own cultural synthesis. The influence of Kush, like rings spreading across still water, would continue to shape the history of Northeast Africa for generations to come. As we sit here in the gentle darkness, contemplating the ruins of Meroë, we can see them not as symbols of failure, but as testaments to the enduring human spirit. The people of Kush created something beautiful and lasting in their corner of the world. They proved that African civilizations could achieve greatness, could create art and architecture that rivaled anything produced in the ancient world, could govern vast territories with wisdom and justice. Their pyramids, weathered by centuries of sand and wind, still stand as monuments to their achievement. Their artifacts, scattered in museums around the world, still speak of their skill and creativity. Their genetic legacy lives on in the peoples of Sudan and Ethiopia, in the faces of those who walk the same lands their ancestors once ruled. The Kingdom of Kush reminds us that all human civilizations are temporary, that even the mightiest empires must eventually yield to the passage of time. But it also reminds us that the human capacity for achievement, for creating beauty and meaning in the face of an indifferent universe, is eternal. The pharaohs of Kush, those black rulers who once wore the double crown of Egypt, may have passed into the realm of memory, but their legacy lives on as the night deepens around us, and the stars wheel overhead in their ancient patterns. We can take comfort in the knowledge that the story of Kush is not really a story of ending, but of transformation. The kingdom may have fallen, but the spirit that created it, the human desire to build something greater than ourselves, to leave a mark upon the world that will outlast our brief existence, continues to inspire us. In the quiet of this African night, with the Nile flowing softly past the ruins of ancient glory, we can hear the echo of their achievement. The Kingdom of Kush, the land of the Black Pharaohs, the civilization that proved Africa's capacity for greatness, lives on in the dreams of those who refuse to let the past be forgotten, who insist that the full story of human achievement must be told. And so we let their memories settle gently into our hearts, like sand settling after a desert storm, knowing that in remembering them, we keep alive something precious and irreplaceable, something that the passage of time cannot destroy. The African moon has traced its gentle arc across the star-filled sky, and our journey through the magnificent realm of Kush draws to its peaceful close. We have walked together through the golden sands of time, witnessed the rise of a civilization that challenged the very foundations of what the ancient world believed possible, and felt the quiet dignity of a people who refused to be forgotten. In this final chapter of our story, as the desert wind carries the whispers of ancient voices across the silent stones of Meroë, let us pause to reflect on what we have discovered. For the Kingdom of Kush was more than just another entry in the annals of history. It was a testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit, a beacon of African achievement that shone brightly in the darkness of prejudice and misunderstanding. Picture, if you will, the world as it was 3,000 years ago. The Mediterranean basin was dominated by emerging civilizations, each believing itself to be the center of human achievement. The Egyptians, with their towering pyramids and elaborate burial practices, saw themselves as the eternal guardians of order and civilization. The Assyrians, with their iron weapons and disciplined armies, believed that military might was the true measure of a people's worth. The Greeks, with their philosophy and art, considered themselves the inheritors of all wisdom. Yet from the south, from the heart of Africa itself, came a kingdom that would challenge every assumption about racial hierarchy and cultural superiority. The rulers of Kush, with their dark skin and proud bearing, would prove that greatness knows no color, that civilization can flourish in any corner of the world, where human beings dare to dream of something greater than themselves. The Black Pharaohs of Egypt deserve recognition, not just in history books, but in the global understanding of African heritage. Their story is a testament to resilience, leadership, and cultural pride. And indeed, as we settle into the comfortable darkness of this African evening, we can feel the weight of that recognition settling around us like a warm embrace. The pharaohs of Kush did not merely conquer Egypt. They saved it when the great civilization of the Nile had fallen into chaos and division, when the ancient traditions were crumbling and the temples lay in ruins. It was the black kings from the south who restored order, who rebuilt the monuments, who rekindled the flame of Egyptian greatness. They came not as destroyers, but as preservers, not as conquerors, but as guardians of a sacred trust. They assimilated into society by reaffirming ancient Egyptian religious traditions, temples, and artistic forms, while introducing some unique aspects of Kushite culture. It was during the 25th dynasty that the Nile Valley saw the first widespread construction of pyramids since the Middle Kingdom. In their hands, the ancient traditions were not just preserved, but transformed, enriched by the unique perspective of Africa's own children. The legacy of Kush extends far beyond the political achievements of its rulers. A syncretistic culture thus arose in Kush, fashioned by that of Egypt to the north and those of African peoples to the south. This blending of influences created something entirely new, a civilization that was neither purely Egyptian nor purely African, but uniquely Kushite. It was a culture that celebrated diversity, that found strength in the marriage of different traditions, that proved that human achievement flourishes best when different peoples learn from one another. In our modern world, still grappling with questions of race and identity, the story of Kush offers us something precious, proof that African civilizations were not peripheral to the grand narrative of human history, but central to it. Kush, the Egyptian name for ancient Nubia, was the site of a highly advanced, ancient black African civilization that rivaled ancient Egypt in wealth, power, and cultural development. This was not a kingdom that existed in isolation, but one that helped shape the ancient world, that contributed to the great conversation of civilizations that has continued across the millennia. The archaeological evidence scattered across the modern nation of Sudan tells a story that textbooks have too often ignored. They mark the site of the ancient city Meroë, a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The center of a powerful civilization, Meroë served as the capital city of Kush, whose robust culture thrived for centuries. Their grand architecture and works of art left a lasting testament to the greatness of the kingdom. These are not merely ruins, but monuments to human potential, physical proof that excellence knows no boundaries of race or geography. As we reflect on the queens and kings who once walked these ancient paths, we are reminded that history is not just about dates and battles, but about the dreams and aspirations of real people. Queen Amanirenas, standing firm against the might of Rome, defending her people with courage that earned the respect of her enemies. Pharaoh Pi, advancing from the south not with fire and sword, but with reverence for the gods and respect for tradition. Taharqa, building temples and fostering learning, proving that true strength lies not in the ability to destroy, but in the power to create. These were individuals who understood that leadership is not about personal glory, but about service to something greater than oneself. They wore the double crown of Egypt, not as conquerors, but as guardians, not as foreigners imposing their will, but as rightful heirs to a sacred tradition. They proved that wisdom and virtue are not the exclusive property of any single people, that greatness can emerge from any corner of the world, where human beings are willing to strive for excellence. In our modern world, where discussions of race and identity often generate more heat than light, the story of Kush offers us a different model for understanding human achievement. Here was a civilization that succeeded not by rejecting other cultures, but by learning from them, not by claiming superiority, but by demonstrating excellence. Its contributions to art, language, religion, and economics deserve recognition and appreciation. The Kushites' ability to adapt and thrive in their environment is a testament to their ingenuity and resilience. The technological innovations of Kush, their mastery of ironworking, their sophisticated understanding of agriculture and trade, their development of their own unique writing system, all of these achievements stand as monuments to human creativity and intelligence. They prove that innovation and progress are not the monopoly of any single people, that the capacity for advancement lies within every human community, willing to embrace learning and growth. Perhaps most importantly, the story of Kush reminds us that the past is not a fixed narrative, but a living conversation between generations. For too long, the achievements of African civilizations have been marginalized or ignored in the telling of human history. But as we uncover more evidence, as we listen more carefully to the voices that have been silenced, we discover that the story of humanity is far richer and more complex than we once believed. The recognition of Kush's achievements is not about replacing one biased narrative with another, but about embracing the full complexity of human history. It is about understanding that civilization is not a river with a single source, but an ocean fed by countless streams, each contributing its unique gifts to the whole. The pharaohs of Kush, those black rulers who once commanded the loyalty of millions, are part of that great conversation. Voices that deserve to be heard and celebrated. As we prepare to close this gentle evening's journey, let us carry with us the lessons that Kush has taught us. That greatness is not determined by the color of one's skin, but by the content of one's character. That civilizations flourish when they learn from one another rather than when they isolate themselves. That the true measure of a people lies not in their ability to dominate others, but in their capacity to create beauty, to foster learning, to build something lasting and meaningful. The moon continues its ancient journey across the African sky, the same moon that once shone down on the coronation ceremonies of Kushite pharaohs, that witnessed the construction of their pyramids, that illuminated the faces of their artists and scholars and priests. In its gentle light we can see the connections that bind us all together, the shared humanity that transcends the artificial divisions of race and nationality. Join the movement of recognizing the brilliance of the Black Pharaohs because, let's be honest, their legacy rocks harder than any watered-down version of history that ignores their contributions. Their story is our story. Their achievements are humanity's achievements. Their legacy is a gift to all who seek to understand the full richness of our shared past. In the silence of this desert night, with the ancient stones of Meroë standing sentinel under the stars, we can hear the echo of their greatness still reverberating across the centuries. The Kingdom of Kush may have faded from political prominence, but its spiritual legacy lives on in every effort to build a more just and inclusive understanding of human history. They once wore the crown and lit the southern path, these Black Pharaohs of Kush, these African kings and queens who proved that excellence knows no boundaries. Their light continues to shine, a beacon of hope and inspiration for all who refuse to accept narrow definitions of human potential. In remembering them, we honor not just their memory, but our own capacity for greatness, our own ability to rise above the limitations that others would place upon us. And so, as the desert wind carries our whispered thanks across the sands of time, we bid farewell to the pharaohs of Kush, knowing that their story will continue to inspire generations yet to come. They have shown us that the path to greatness is open to all who have the courage to walk it, that the crown of achievement fits any head noble enough to wear it with dignity and wisdom. In the gentle embrace of this African night, we carry their legacy forward, a torch passed from ancient hands to modern hearts, a reminder that the best of human history belongs to all of us, regardless of where we come from or what we look like. The pharaohs of Kush have spoken across the centuries, and their message is clear. Greatness is not a gift reserved for the few, but a possibility that lies within us all. May their memory be a blessing, may their story be a bridge, and may their legacy continue to light the way for all who seek to understand the full glory of human achievement. The Kingdom of Kush lives on, not in the ruins of ancient cities, but in the hearts of all who believe that history, like the human spirit itself, knows no bounds.